Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. He's the spiritual leader of the Tibetan people, who they believe is the living reincarnation of Buddha, who works for peace and enlightenment and the inspiration for millions around the world. But Beijing calls him a dangerous separatist who seeks to split Tibet from China. In 1959, the 14th Dalai Lama fled to India following China's annexation of Tibet in 1951, and just ahead of the slaughter of thousands of Tibetans and monks and the burning of their monasteries by Chinese Communist Party leader Mao Zedong. 6 decades later, on his 89th birthday in July, the Dalai Lama says that he is in good health after his knee surgery in the US. But in his birthday message, he cautioned this. Who may be behind this disinformation? Why did Xi Jinping visit Tibet in June after a 2-year absence? And what difference would the new US legislation promoting a resolution to the Tibet-China dispute, also known as Tibet Resolve Act, make to the future of what China calls Xizang, formerly Tibet Autonomous Region? And with New Delhi's plan to rename more than 20 places in Tibet, is India about to re-enter the fray? Backed, it says, by extensive historical research and widely held local opinion. Joining us today are Lai Yizong, Prospect Foundation President, also Li Pengshun, Students for a Free Tibet-Taiwan Board member, cross-movement activist, and Michael Fay, Formosa Transnational of Council, specializing in cross-border issues, also Forward Taiwan founder. A very warm welcome to all of you on the show today. On July 12th, Joe Biden signed into law the Tibet Resolve Act, which presses Beijing to resolve Tibet's demands for greater autonomy, and also rejects the PRC's statement that Tibet has been part of China since ancient times. Biden said, "I share the Congress bipartisan commitment to advancing the human rights of Tibetans and supporting efforts to preserve their distinct linguistic, cultural and religious heritage. My administration will continue to call on China to resume direct dialogue without preconditions with the Dalai Lama to seek a settlement that resolves differences and leads to a negotiated agreement on Tibet." Now, Beijing has slammed the move, vowing to defend its interests. This is what they said ahead of the law being ratified.
西藏事务是中国内政，不容任何外部势力干涉。我们敦促美方充分认清涉藏问题的重要性和敏感性，切实尊重中方核心利益，不同达赖集团进行任何形式的接触，停止向外界发出错误信息。
Michael, so the White House statement actually specifies that the US still recognizes Tibet as part of China. So how much of a shift in policy is this?
The simple answer is that not much of a shift, because in the United States system, most power over foreign policy is vested in the president. So the president gets to determine who's a state, who's an autonomous region, and he repeated that very clearly. But Congress also plays an important role in shaping the contours of US foreign policy. It doesn't do it very often. One of the most dramatic instances that should be familiar to everyone here in Taiwan was the Taiwan Relations Act. And I think that we can see the 2002 Tibetan Policy Act and this new resolution as being very similar. Congress is expressing its sense that the executive needs to do more. One reason is that it hasn't been working. The past policy talks have ended since 2010. A second reason is the Dalai Lama, as we just saw in the video, is a frail shadow of his former self. He's not going to be around forever, and who will lead the Tibetan people? But most importantly, in the resolution, there are two really new things. Number one, the definition of Tibet is expanded beyond just what China calls the Tibetan Autonomous Region to other integrally Tibetan parts of China, such as Gansu, parts of Yunnan, a significant chunk of western Sichuan, and all of these have traditionally been part of Tibet, and the U.S. is now recognizing it.
So essentially taking back some of that land from China. What is the significance of that? Where do you think that's leading to?
Well, I think the significance is that the United States is recognizing that the current Tibetan Autonomous Region, or as now they want to call it the Xizang Autonomous Region, was a creation of the People's Republic of China very early on in that state's history, and does not reflect the historical extent of the Tibetan, not only polity, but Tibetan civilization. A very clear example of this is that in 1959, when there was a bloody resistance to the Chinese takeover of Tibet, one of the most important centers of resistance was an area called Kham, which is actually entirely in western Sichuan. And if you go there today, you will see Tibetan nomads are the majority. And there's a similar situation in Deqin, in the northern corner of Yunnan. It's probably 90% Tibetan. So Gansu and Qinghai are also very similar as well. So the current boundaries of the Tibetan Autonomous Region are kind of a shadow of what Tibet once was. And the United States is trying to recognize that fact now. The second major point is apparently there are going to be funds appropriated to counter Chinese misinformation about Tibet. And so those are the two big takeaways that we need to pay attention to.
Pengxuan, so it is, as Michael said, wanting to counter that disinformation about Tibet being part of China since ancient times. So is Tibet part of China? Has it been for a long time?
Yeah, well, the short answer would be no, but of course it comes with a long history of how China and Tibet has been encountering each other. So like the Tibet Empire has been engaging with China by the time it was like the Tang Empire since the 7th century. So
as an independent state?
As an independent state. And of course, you know, there have been like encounters of military forces, and that's how we heard about the story of Princess Wenchen marrying into Tibet to seek peace, you know, with the Tibetan emperor. And so that kind of continues to the 13th centuries. By the time China, the whole continent was under the Yuan Empire by Mongolian, and the Tibetan leader then, which who was regarded by Tibetan as one of their previous.
So if you could summarize for us, so before the CCP came along,
exactly,
was Tibet actually part of China?
Well, for Tibetans, it's never be. But of course, we can see that in the modern Chinese historical narrative, they've been claiming that. But if we trace it back to the ancient historical texts, like the history of Ming Dynasty, which was written in the Qing Dynasty, they actually put Tibet as like a foreign state in their historical, you know, chapters. Yeah. So with that said, I would say actually it is the Tibet has been always a part of China is a narrative that been constructed by, I would say, by PRC, but more or less by the Republic of China as well since 1912.
I just want to ask you on the so-called deal between China and Britain in 1906. Tell us about, you know, the significance of that.
Well, of course, the significance of having a deal with other foreign country, it means that you have your own sovereignty, right? So with that said, if Tibet has been always a part of China, then the entity, the legal entity to sign the said treaty or contract will actually be the Chinese government themselves. But with that said, and also there has been a couple of different treaties following after that particular ones, like the Simla treaty, the Simla agreements with, or actually with ROC, Tibet, and the Great Britain. There are actually different parties signing all these agreements. So I would say that actually kind of stressed the fact that Tibet has been always a independent state before the Chinese occupation in 1959.
Okay, President Lai, let's get on to the disinformation surrounding the One China principle. There are some people trying to link Tibet to this and to say that essentially the US is challenging the One China principle. Well, why are they doing that?
I think interestingly, from the Taiwanese perspective, we always thought that the One China principle is related with Taiwan, but apparently for Beijing, One China principle also related with other things. So the issue about Tibet is that China does not want anyone to challenge China's position about Tibet. Even though, like the Resolve Tibet Act, the White House also later on said that they recognize Tibet as a part of China. But however, China continue to stress that this is in violation or challenging the One China principles.
So is Tibet actually in the One China principle?
That's what Chinese said. The Tibet is part of China, but more than that, what the Beijing wanted to claim is that the One China principle means that for anything related with Tibet, you have to follow Chinese narrative. So that's a key point. It's not just about the recognizing Tibet as a part of China, just like the United States did, but Tibet should be part of China since ancient time.
Pengxuan, China criticizes the US for essentially interfering in China's internal affairs, and it says that Washington is trying to basically divide and attack China. Is the US interfering in China's domestic issues?
Well, if we consider this as a domestic issue, then of course that is an interference with domestic politics. But I think in many sense, even in I think the aspect of international law, the invasion in 1959 is, of course, illegal, and that can lead to the upcoming 60 years of occupation, illegal occupation inside Tibet. And of course, even though beside the fact that
what makes it illegal? Because there was an agreement that was signed between the Dalai Lama and the Chinese.
Yeah, and of course, with the said agreements, the 17-point agreement signed in 1951, it talked about how they are going to gradually liberate Tibet from its serfdom and the old states of Tibet into a more liberated country. But by that time, actually, the agreement was signed by Ngawang Jigme, one of the Tibetan's official, sending to Beijing for signing the agreement. And there was actually a really interesting story happening in between, because the said official, he intentionally refused to sign the agreement itself. But if we look into March 1959, after His Holiest Dalai Lama fled into India in late March, I believe in March 19th, he actually renounced the whole signing procedures and revealing to the public that the whole procedure was under the huge pressure, and of course the pressure of the People's Liberation Army in Lhasa during the time. So I would say, although there was agreements that during the time that was signed by the two parties, but that was proven illegal afterward.
If I could just jump in for a second from an international law perspective. After the founding of the United Nations, one of the most important principles that was determined is that peoples, and the Tibetans are clearly a people, have the right to self-determination. And they have not been able to exercise that right. And a second rule of international law is that you cannot take over territory by force. And I would say that China has violated both of those fundamental post-war principles of law, and therefore it is not entirely a purely internal matter.
Yeah, and in the 17-point agreement, which is what Panchen was saying, China actually promised the Dalai Lama in Tibet a number of things. For example, that regional autonomy, that the Dalai Lama's powers would be untouched, that Buddhism would be respected, that monks and monasteries would be protected. So on that level, Michael, those points have been reneged upon. The agreement which the Dalai Lama agreed to in order to become part of China was reneged upon.
I think there's a very strong argument that that was the case, and that's what removes this question from being purely a question of internal law, like China would like it to be and constantly spreads misinformation about.
All right. President Lai, so do you see that the US legislation is perhaps one step towards building up to this argument, that essentially to say that the occupation by China of Tibet is illegal?
I do not think that the legislation itself is actually moving in that directions. It basically focuses on the fact that how the Chinese action in Tibet that violates, even if the Tibet is part of China, and also violate universal declaration of the human rights, as well as other humanitarian matters. And the issue about the future of the Tibet, this legislation actually talks about how to deal with that issue, especially Dalai Lama. His Holiness Dalai Lama, right now he is 89, although he's still in good health, but he cannot be here forever. And then the issue about the reincarnation, who will be the next Dalai Lama will be the issue. But of course, right now Tibet already transitioned to more of civilian government, so they have a democratic elected system to choose their own political leaders, and His Holiness basically will be the spiritual leader. So that makes the issue a little bit less as the tensions. But we do know that China knows how the Dalai Lama, as well as the Panchen Lama, and the spiritual leader, and they have a tremendous political influence in the Tibetan communities. So that back in 1995, China basically hijacked a 5-year-old Panchen Lama into Beijing, and right now we do not know where this boy, right now should be a young man, his whereabouts.
So he was chosen actually by Dalai Lama, and then this choice was rejected.
No. He's not chosen. He's confirmed. Because according to Tibet, only the people who can choose where he or she will reincarnate from. Right now, China also would like to utilize this because it seems that the current Dalai Lama will be the last obstacles for them to have to seize the control of the whole Tibet.
Peng Shuan, so if China was to choose the successor, what would that mean for Tibetan Buddhism?
Yeah, of course, as we can see in the case of Panchen Lama, like they basically trying to create a new political puppet to, helping them bring out that political legitimacy, or even just like the spiritual legitimacy to put controls on the Tibetan people. And I think for Dalai Lama, it actually comes to the next level, because as we can see, His Holiness since his escapes into exile, he has been so influential around the world. He basically created the whole international Tibetan Buddhism community. The Tibetan people inside Tibet, they are still having really high hopes on His Holiness and on how the Tibet can be free one day under his guidance. And that is basically just kill their hope and just to further integrating them into Chinese, politically Chinese, to as CCP has wished for a long time.
Michael, what options are open to the Dalai Lama, to Tibetans? I mean, there was a hint, he hinted before that perhaps he wouldn't actually reincarnate.
Yes, I think that's the most interesting possibility, that he simply refuses to, or decides that he's not going to reincarnate to prevent the appearance of a figurehead Lama in China who would, lessen the power of the Tibetan movement. I think that's an extremely interesting and possibly a strategic move. On the other hand, the Dalai Lama is, of course, the spiritual glue that holds together the Tibetan people, both inside Tibet. I mean, when you go to Tibet today, you still see, despite penalties, pictures of the Dalai Lama in people's houses, and the veneration for him is very striking. And so sometimes I wonder if the Dalai Lama can be compared imperfectly to the Pope, who is both a temporal and a spiritual leader. Well, what if Pope Benedict decided that he would be the last pope? That would be devastating to the Catholic Church, and I suspect the same thing would happen if the Dalai Lama did something like that too, although it potentially would have an enormous political effect that might be for the better as well. We'll just have to see what his wisdom tells him to do.
And Michael McCaul, who's the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the U.S. House of Representatives, he visited the Dalai Lama in India before his U.S. operation on his knee, together with a former U.S. House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi. Now, he said at that meeting with the Dalai Lama that the U.S. would not allow China to choose a successor. Practically speaking, what can the U.S. do?
I don't think the U.S. is in a position to prevent the Dalai Lama, the China from choosing a Dalai Lama if they so choose. Sometimes Americans exaggerate or overimagine how much power they have in the world. On the other hand, I do believe that by going, he's the sitting head of the House Committee on Foreign Affairs. He's a very powerful congressman, and of course he had Nancy Pelosi with him. It was kind of a parallel trip to the one to Taiwan that they made, and I think that his main message was he was telling China that U.S. congressmen and senators are representatives of an independent branch of government, and they can and will go wherever they please, including places that China does not want them to go to. I believe that was the main significance of the visit.
Okay, yeah, because President Lai, you spoke about, the control of China over even people meeting with the Dalai Lama itself. That delegation that we spoke about, McCaul and Pelosi, also visited New Delhi. How can India, do you think, cooperate with Tibet and the U.S.?
You'll be in very tricky issues because the India, first of all, of course, even today, still recognize Tibet as a part of China. I think at least for the India and the United States, at least in terms of executive branch, they haven't challenged the Chinese position about Tibet, but they do have various say regarding the Chinese treatment about the Tibetan people, as well as the area of the Tibetan coverage and the boundary between China and India regarding where the Tibet resides. So there are the area that they can cooperate and form a common line vis-a-vis China.
Panchen, so for you, what is the significance of India announcing that it will rename those places in Arunachal Pradesh, given that, if we go back historically, in 1956, the Dalai Lama went to India and asked for support for its confrontation with China, and that was denied. Is this now India saying that it will take a strong stance on Tibet?
Yeah, well, I think since 1959, we've been seeing India using the so-called Tibet card quite strategically. Of course, I think back then, India did miss a couple of really good opportunities to substantially support Tibet. Like in around 1959, they've been your UN member. They actually didn't support Tibet in the international spaces. But very recently, we can see that the current Modi administration has been taking more, I would say, bolder moves toward that. Also, just want to echo what President Lai said. The so-called Sino-India border is actually Tibet-India border. And so by recognizing, stressing more on the existence of Tibet. Probably not the fully recognition of Tibet yet, but having that recognition of the existence of Tibet as an area that actually would help India pushing forward their narrative on owning having the sovereignty of the Arunachal Pradesh. Because before PRC, they are actually having this organic and also blurry, border during the time with Tibet.
Very final thoughts, Michael, very briefly.
The relations between India and China are enormously complex and became even more complex after the 1962 Sino-Indian War. India was deeply shocked by that war. It believed that China was on its side, part of the southern countries, the non-aligned movement. It couldn't believe that it was attacked and that it was badly defeated. So since then, obviously, Tibet has become a card that it can play. Over the last 10 years or so, we're seeing a real shift towards assimilation. Everyone is going to become Han Chinese. They're going to speak Mandarin. They're not going to have weird religious buildings, and intermarriage is being encouraged. So one of the things that we're seeing that we need to keep a very close eye on is this seismic shift in China's ethnic policies.
Thank you so much, Michael Feihe, Li Pengxuan, and President Lai Yizong for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.